Somewhere in the ancient world, a single document was written that contained the complete blueprint of reality. And every major power structure in human history has spent centuries making sure you never truly understood what it said. Because hidden inside 7 deceptively simple lines, Hermes Trismegistus encoded a truth so devastating to the system built above you that the moment you fully grasp it, the invisible walls of your prison will begin to crack. And they knew it. There's a text so old that no one can agree on where it truly came from. Some say it was carved onto a slab of green stone found clutched in the hands of a dead man inside a sealed Egyptian tomb. Others say it was discovered beneath the Great Sphinx, buried in a vault that predates the oldest known civilization. Some say Hermes Trismegistus himself, a figure so ancient he exists on the razor's edge between man and myth, inscribed it before the last great age of the world collapsed into darkness and forgetting. What nearly everyone agrees on, however, is this: the Emerald Tablet is not just old. It is the oldest, and what it contains is not poetry, not mythology, not the ramblings of a priest trying to justify a dying religion. It is a map of reality itself. And the fact that you were never taught to read it is not an accident. To understand why this matters, you have to understand who Hermes Trismegistus actually was, or more precisely, what he represented. The name itself tells you everything. Hermes, the Greek messenger of the gods, the deity of knowledge, boundaries, and the space between worlds. Trismegistus, meaning thrice greatest. This was not a humble title. This was a declaration. The Egyptians called him Thoth, the ibis-headed keeper of divine records, the one who weighed the soul against a feather in the hall of judgment, the one who invented writing itself so that truth could survive the death of those who carried it. When the Greek world and the Egyptian world collided in the city of Alexandria, these two figures merged into one being. Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice greatest. Not a god, not a man, something that existed before the boundary between those two things was drawn. And this being, this intelligence older than any religion that currently exists on this earth, left behind a body of knowledge known as the Hermetic texts. At the very center of those texts, beating like a heart, is the Emerald Tablet. For centuries, the Western world encountered the Emerald Tablet only through Arabic translations, texts that had passed through so many hands and so many cultures that the original shape of the knowledge had been worn smooth like a stone in a river. The earliest known Arabic version appeared in a text called the Book of the Secret of Creation, written sometime in the 8th century Anno Domini, that is approximately 800 years after the time of Jesus of Nazareth. From Arabic, it moved into Latin, and from Latin it spread across the monasteries and alchemical laboratories of medieval Europe. Isaac Newton himself, the man credited with discovering the laws of gravity and laying the foundation of modern physics, owned a personal copy and translated it by hand. He kept his translation private for years. Think about that. The man who gave us the mathematical language to describe the physical universe looked at the Emerald Tablet and decided what was inside, it was not something to be shared casually. He was not alone in that judgment. The church had been making the same decision for a very long time. The opening line of the Emerald Tablet is perhaps the most famous and most misunderstood sentence in the entire history of Western esoteric thought. In Latin, it reads, "As above, so below, as within, so without." You have seen this phrase everywhere. It has been printed on jewelry, tattooed on skin, quoted in spiritual self-help books between passages about gratitude, journaling, and the law of attraction. And in being everywhere, it has become invisible. It has become wallpaper. But when Hermes Trismegistus wrote those words, he was not writing an inspirational quote. He was describing the fundamental architecture of a trapped reality. He was telling you, in the plainest language he could use without being immediately executed, that the world you experience as real is a reflection, a mirror image. And the question he was implicitly asking, the question that every institution of power in every era since has worked furiously to prevent you from asking, is this a reflection of what? And who built the mirror? This is where the Gnostic tradition and the Hermetic tradition converge in a way that should make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. The Gnostics, whose texts were buried in the desert cliffs of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt and hidden for over 1,600 years, described a false creator they called the demiurge, a blind, arrogant being who fashioned the material world not from divine love, but from ignorance. A being who declared himself the only God precisely because he could not perceive anything above himself. The Hermetic texts describe the same architecture from a different angle. They speak of the nous, the divine mind, the true intelligence that exists above and beyond the material creation. And they describe the material world as a dense, distorted echo of that higher reality. As above, so below. But the below in this system is not a copy of something wonderful. It is a copy of something infinite being rendered through a broken lens. And the lens was broken intentionally, because a soul that believes the broken reflection is the original will never go looking for the source. The second layer of the Emerald Tablets' encoded warning concerns the nature of what Hermes Trismegistus called the one thing. In the text, he writes that all things come from this one thing through the adaptation of the one. For centuries, alchemists interpreted this literally. They believed it referred to a physical substance, the philosopher's stone, a material capable of transmuting base metals into gold. Entire lives were spent in laboratories, hunched over furnaces, mixing mercury and sulfur and lead, searching for a physical key to a metaphysical door. And the church was perfectly content to let them search there. Because as long as the alchemist believed the one thing was a substance you could hold in your hand, he would never discover what it actually is. The one thing that Hermes Trismegistus was describing is consciousness itself. Not a rock, not a powder, not a chemical reaction. The irreducible, non-material awareness that exists before the material world and upon which the material world is projected like an image on a screen. The Gnostics called the divine spark. The Hindus called it Atman. The Sufis called it the secret of secrets. Hermes Trismegistus called it the one thing, and he encoded it in language that would survive the burning of libraries and the torture of those who read them. The third critical layer of the Emerald Tablet speaks of ascent. Hermes Trismegistus writes, "It ascends from earth to heaven and descends again to earth and receives the power of the superiors and the inferiors." Read carelessly. This sounds like a description of the water cycle. Read carefully. Read the way a Gnostic who has survived the destruction of their community and hidden their texts in clay jars beneath the desert floor would read it. It is a description of the soul's movement through the layers of a controlled reality. The soul descends. It enters the material world. It is surrounded by what the Gnostics call the archons, the planetary rulers, the cosmic administrators, the wardens of the prison, each one stripping the soul of its divine memory as it passes through each layer on the way down. And then, if the soul awakens, if it grasps the gnosis, the direct inner knowing that cannot be given by a priest or a pope or an emperor, it begins to ascend. It passes back through each layer. It reclaims what was taken. It rises through the spheres of the planetary archons and emerges, finally, into the pleroma, the fullness, the true light, the realm above the demiurge's reach. The Emerald Tablet is not a recipe for making gold. It is a map for making that journey. Now here is the part that the institutional powers of every era have understood with a clarity they will never admit publicly. If the Emerald Tablet is a map, and if what it maps is the path of the soul through a controlled reality back to its true origin, then its existence is a direct threat to every system built on the assumption that the soul needs an intermediary. Every church that tells you that you need a priest to speak to God. Every government that tells you that you need their permission to be free. Every social system that tells you that your value is determined by your productivity inside the machine. All of these systems depend, at their deepest level, on the soul not knowing what it is. On the soul remaining convinced that the broken reflection is the original. The moment enough souls read that map and begin to use it, the entire architecture of control begins to dissolve. This is not metaphor. This is not speculation. This is the reason that the Hermetic texts were classified as dangerous. This is the reason that figures like Giordano Bruno, who synthesized Hermetic and Gnostic ideas and dared to teach them publicly, were burned alive in the Campo de Fiori in Rome in the year 1600 Anno Domini. This is the reason that Newton kept his translation of the Emerald Tablet in a drawer. The irony that almost no one talks about is that modern physics has spent the last century independently arriving at conclusions that the Emerald Tablet encoded thousands of years ago. Quantum mechanics tells us that the observer affects the observed, that consciousness is not separate from reality, but participates in its construction. The double-slit experiment, one of the most replicated and most disturbing experiments in the history of science, demonstrates that particles behave differently when they are being watched. As above, so below. As within, so without. The universe, at its most fundamental level, appears to be responsive to awareness. This is not mysticism. This is what the equations say. And yet the mainstream scientific establishment treats this conclusion with the same discomfort that the medieval church treated the Emerald Tablet. Because if consciousness shapes reality, then the question of whose consciousness and in service of what becomes the most important question that has ever been asked. And powerful systems do not survive the asking of the most important questions. There's one more layer of the Emerald Tablet that almost every modern interpreter skips over because it is the most uncomfortable. Near the end of the text, Hermes Trismegistus writes, "Separate the earth from the fire, the subtle from the gross, gently and with great ingenuity." This line has been interpreted as an instruction in physical alchemy. Separate the elements, purify the substance. But in the Gnostic and Hermetic tradition, earth and fire, subtle and gross, are not chemical descriptions. They're descriptions of the self. The gross is everything you have been given to identify with the body, the personality, the social role, the accumulated fears and desires of a lifetime inside the material world. The subtle is what you are beneath all of that. The divine spark. The fragment of the one thing that the demiurge's system cannot touch, but can absolutely distract. The instruction, separate the subtle from the gross, gently and with great ingenuity, is an instruction in the most radical act available to a human being. It is an instruction to stop identifying with the prison and start identifying with the prisoner. And then, eventually, to realize that the prisoner was never truly imprisoned at all. that the spark at the center of your awareness has always been free. That freedom is not something you achieve. It is something you remember. What Hermes Trismegistus understood, and what the institutions that suppressed his work understood equally well, is that a human being who has made that separation, who has learned to distinguish between what they have been given to be and what they actually are, cannot be fully controlled. They can be inconvenienced. They can be threatened. They can be burned alive in a public square in Rome. But they cannot be made to forget what they have seen. Because gnosis, real gnosis, not intellectual knowledge, but direct inner recognition, does not live in a book that can be burned or a teacher that can be silenced. It lives in the part of you that was there before this body, before this name, before this life, inside the demiurge's carefully managed simulation of reality. The emerald tablet survived every attempt to bury it because it is, at its core, a description of something that cannot be destroyed. And every time a human being sits in silence and asks, genuinely asks, what am I beneath all of this? They are reading the Emerald Tablet, whether they have ever heard of it or not. The Emerald Tablet was never meant for scholars, emperors, or priests. It was meant for you, the one sitting with this quiet, persistent feeling that reality is thinner than it appears. Hermes Trismegistus did not hide his message because it was too complex. He hid it because it was too simple. As above, so below. The prison is real, but so is the key, and it has always been inside the one place they could never search. You, if what you just heard cracked something open inside you, do not let it close again. Subscribe to Gnostic Inner Eye and stay inside this conversation, because what comes next goes even deeper. Leave a comment below and tell us. What did they take from you that you're only now beginning to remember? The ones who built this system are counting on your silence. Prove them wrong.